The latter was less abrupt, but the former more wooded. The engineer ascertained by consulting his pocket compass that the direction of the river from the first turn was obviously southwest and northeast, and nearly straight for a length of about 3 miles. But it was to be supposed that this direction changed beyond that point, and that the Mersey continued to the northwest, towards the spurs of Mount Franklin, among which the river rose. During one of these excursions, Gideon Spilett managed to get hold of 2 couples of living Gallinaceae. They were birds with long, thin beaks, lengthened necks, short wings, and without any appearance of a tail. Herbert rightly gave them the name of tinamons, and it was resolved that they should be the first tenants of their future poultry yard. But till then, the guns had not spoken, and the first report, which awoke the echoes of the forest of the far west, was provoked by the appearance of a beautiful bird, resembling the kingfisher. "I recognize him," cried Pencroft, and it seemed as if his gun went off by itself. "What do you recognize?" asked the reporter. "The bird which escaped us on our first excursion, and from which we gave the name to that part of the forest." "A jacamar," cried Herbert. It was indeed a jacamar, of which the plumage shines with a metallic luster. A shot brought it to the ground, and Top carried it to the canoe. At the same time, 6 lories were brought down. The lory is of the size of a pigeon, the plumage dashed with green, part of the wings crimson, and its crest bordered with white. To the young boy belonged the honor of this shot, and he was proud enough of it. Lories are better food than the jacamar, the flesh of which is rather tough, but it was difficult to persuade Pencroft that he had not killed the king of eatable birds. It was 10 o'clock in the morning when the canoe reached a second angle of the Mersey, nearly 5 miles from its mouth. Here a halt was made for breakfast under the shade of some splendid trees. The river still measured from 60 to 70 feet in breadth, and its bed from 5 to 6 feet in depth. The engineer had observed that it was increased by numerous affluents, but they were unnavigable, being simply little streams. As to the forest, including Jacamar Wood, as well as the forests of the far west, it extended as far as the eye could reach. In no place, either in the depths of the forest or under the trees on the banks of the Mersey, was the presence of man revealed. The explorers could not discover one suspicious trace. It was evident that the woodman's axe had never touched these trees, that the pioneer's knife had never severed the creepers hanging from one trunk to another in the midst of tangled brushwood and long grass. If castaways had landed on the island, they could not have yet quitted the shore, and it was not in the woods that the survivors of the supposed shipwreck should be sought. "Is it tobacco? Is it tobacco?" The engineer therefore manifested some impatience to reach the western coast of Lincoln Island, which was at least 5 miles distant according to his estimation. The voyage was continued, and as the Mersey appeared to flow not towards the shore, but rather towards Mount Franklin, it was decided that they should use the boat as long as there was enough water under its keel to float it. It was both fatigue spared and time gained, for they would have been obliged to cut a path through the thick wood with their axes. But soon the flow completely failed them, either the tide was going down, and it was about the hour, or it could no longer be felt at this distance from the mouth of the Mersey. They had therefore to make use of the oars. Herbert and Neb each took one, and Pencroft took the scull. The forest soon became less dense, the trees grew further apart and often quite isolated, but the further they were from each other the more magnificent they appeared, profiting, as they did, by the free, pure air which circulated around them. What splendid specimens of the flora of this latitude! Certainly, their presence would have been enough for a botanist to name without hesitation the parallel which traversed Lincoln Island. "Eucalypti," cried Herbert. They were, in fact, those splendid trees, the giants of the extratropical zone, the congeners of the Australian and New Zealand eucalyptus, both situated under the same latitude as Lincoln Island. Some rose to a height of 200 feet. Their trunks at the base measured 20 feet in circumference, and their bark was covered by a network of furrows containing a red, sweet-smelling gum. Nothing is more wonderful or more singular than those enormous specimens of the order of the Myrtaceae, with their leaves placed vertically and not horizontally, so that an edge and not a surface looks upwards, the effect being that the sun's rays penetrate more freely among the trees. The halt for breakfast, the halt for breakfast. The ground at the foot of the eucalypti was carpeted with grass, and from the bushes escaped flights of little birds, which glittered in the sunlight like winged rubies. "These are something like trees," cried Neb, "but are they good for anything?" "Pooh," replied Pencroft. "Of course there are vegetable giants as well as human giants, and they are no good, except to show themselves at fairs." "I think that you are mistaken, Pencroft," replied Gideon Spilett, "and that the wood of the eucalyptus has begun to be very advantageously employed in cabinet-making." "And I may add," said Herbert, "that the eucalyptus belongs to a family which comprises many useful members: the guava tree, from whose fruit guava jelly is made; the clove tree, which produces the spice; the pomegranate tree, which bears pomegranates; the Eugetia cauliflora, the fruit of which is used in making a tolerable wine; the Uguay myrtle, which contains an excellent alcoholic liquor; the Caryophyllus myrtle, of which the bark forms an esteemed cinnamon; the Eugenia pimenta, from whence comes Jamaica pepper; the common myrtle, from whose buds and berries spice is sometimes made; the Eucalyptus mannifera, which yields a sweet sort of manna; the Guinea eucalyptus, the sap of which is transformed into beer by fermentation. In short, all those trees known under the name of gum trees or ironbark trees in Australia belong to this family of the Myrtaceae, which contains 46 genera and 1,300 species. The lad was allowed to run on, and he delivered his little botanical lecture with great animation. Cyrus Harding listened smiling, and Pencroft with an indescribable feeling of pride. "Very good, Herbert," replied Pencroft, "but I could swear that all those useful specimens you have just told us about are none of them giants like these." "That is true, Pencroft." "That supports what I said," returned the sailor, "namely, that these giants are good for nothing." "There you are wrong, Pencroft," said the engineer. "These gigantic eucalypti which shelter us are good for something." "And what is that?" "To render the countries which they inhabit healthy. Do you know what they are called in Australia and New Zealand?" "No, Captain." "They are called fever trees." "Because they give fevers." "No, because they prevent them." "Good, I must note that," said the reporter. "Note it then, my dear Spilett, for it appears proved that the presence of the eucalyptus is enough to neutralize miasmas. This natural antidote has been tried in certain countries in the middle of Europe and the north of Africa, where the soil was absolutely unhealthy and the sanitary condition of the inhabitants has been gradually ameliorated. No more intermittent fevers prevail in the regions now covered with forests of the Myrtaceae. This fact is now beyond doubt, and it is a happy circumstance for us settlers in Lincoln Island." "Ah, what an island, what a blessed island!" cried Pencroft. "I tell you it wants nothing unless it is." "That will come, Pencroft, that will be found," replied the engineer. "But now we must continue our voyage and push on as far as the river will carry our boat." Exploration was therefore continued for another 2 miles in the midst of country covered with eucalypti, which predominated in the woods of this portion of the island. The space which they occupied extended as far as the eye could reach on each side of the Mersey, which wound along between high green banks. The bed was often obstructed by long weeds, and even by pointed rocks, which rendered the navigation very difficult. The action of the oars was prevented, and Pencroft was obliged to push with a pole. They found also that the water was becoming shallower and shallower, and that the canoe must soon stop. The sun was already sinking towards the horizon, and the trees threw long shadows on the ground. Cyrus Harding, seeing that he could not hope to reach the western coast of the island in one journey, resolved to camp at the place where any further navigation was prevented by want of water. He calculated that they were still 5 or 6 miles from the coast, and this distance was too great for them to attempt traversing during the night in the midst of unknown woods. The boat was pushed on through the forest, which gradually became thicker again and appeared also to have more inhabitants, for if the eyes of the sailor did not deceive him, he thought he saw bands of monkeys springing among the trees. Sometimes even 2 or 3 of these animals stopped at a little distance from the canoe and gazed at the settlers without manifesting any terror, as if, seeing men for the first time, they had not yet learned to fear them. It would have been easy to bring down one of these quadrumani with a gunshot, and Pencroft was greatly tempted to fire, but Harding opposed so useless a massacre. This was prudent, for the monkeys, or apes rather, appearing to be very powerful and extremely active, it was useless to provoke an unnecessary aggression, and the creatures might, ignorant of the power of the explorers' firearms, have attacked them. It is true that the sailor considered the monkeys from a purely alimentary point of view, for those animals which are herbivorous make very excellent game, but since they had an abundant supply of provisions, it was a pity to waste their ammunition. Towards 4 o'clock, the navigation of the Mersey became exceedingly difficult, for its course was obstructed by aquatic plants and rocks. The banks rose higher and higher, and already they were approaching the spurs of Mount Franklin. The source could not be far off, since it was fed by the water from the southern slopes of the mountain. "In a quarter of an hour," said the sailor, "we shall be obliged to stop, Captain." "Very well, we will stop, Pencroft, and we will make our encampment for the night." "At what distance are we from Granite House?" asked Herbert. "About 7 miles," replied the engineer, taking into calculation, however, the detours of the river, which has carried us to the northwest. "Shall we go on?" asked the reporter. "Yes, as long as we can," replied Cyrus Harding. "Tomorrow, at break of day, we will leave the canoe, and in 2 hours, I hope, we shall cross the distance which separates us from the coast, and then we shall have the whole day in which to explore the shore." "Go ahead," replied Pencroft. But soon the boat grated on the stony bottom of the river, which was now not more than 20 feet in breadth. The trees met like a bower overhead and caused a half-darkness. They also heard the noise of a waterfall, which showed that a few hundred feet up the river there was a natural barrier. Presently, after a sudden turn of the river, a cascade appeared through the trees. The canoe again touched the bottom, and in a few minutes it was moored to a trunk near the right bank. It was nearly 5 o'clock. The last rays of the sun gleamed through the thick foliage and glanced on the little waterfall, making the spray sparkle with all the colors of the rainbow. Beyond that, the Mersey was lost in the brushwood, where it was fed from some hidden source. The different streams which flowed into it increased it to a regular river further down, but here it was simply a shallow, limpid brook. It was agreed to camp here, as the place was charming. The colonists disembarked, and a fire was soon lighted under a clump of trees, among the branches of which Cyrus Harding and his companions could, if it was necessary, take refuge for the night. Supper was quickly devoured, for they were very hungry, and then there was only sleeping to think of. But, as roarings of rather a suspicious nature had been heard during the evening, a good fire was made up for the night, so as to protect the sleepers with its crackling flames. Neb and Pencroft also watched by turns, and did not spare fuel. They thought they saw the dark forms of some wild animals prowling round the camp among the bushes, but the night passed without incident, and the next day, the 31st of October, at 5 o'clock in the morning, all were on foot, ready for a start. Chapter 4. Journey to the coast, troops of monkeys, a new river, the reason the tide was not felt, a woody shore, reptile promontory, Herbert envies Gideon Spilett, explosion of bamboos. It was 6 o'clock in the morning when the settlers, after a hasty breakfast, set out to reach by the shortest way the western coast of the island. And how long would it take to do this? Cyrus Harding had said 2 hours, but of course that depended on the nature of the obstacles they might meet with. As it was probable that they would have to cut a path through the grass, shrubs, and creepers, they marched axe in hand, and with guns also ready, wisely taking warning from the cries of the wild beasts heard in the night. The exact position of the encampment could be determined by the bearing of Mount Franklin, and as the volcano arose in the north at a distance of less than 3 miles, they had only to go straight towards the southwest to reach the western coast. They set out, having first carefully secured the canoe. Pencroft and Neb carried sufficient provisions for the little band for at least 2 days. It would not thus be necessary to hunt. The engineer advised his companions to refrain from firing, that their presence might not be betrayed to anyone near the shore. The first hatchet blows were given among the brushwood in the midst of some mastic trees, a little above the cascade, and his compass in his hand, Cyrus Harding led the way. The forest here was composed for the most part of trees which had already been met with near the lake and on Prospect Heights. There were deodars, Douglas firs, casuarinas, gum trees, eucalypti, hibiscus, cedars, and other trees, generally of a moderate size, for their number prevented their growth. Since their departure, the settlers had descended the slopes, which constituted the mountain system of the island, onto dry soil, but the luxuriant vegetation of which indicated it to be watered either by some subterranean marsh or by some stream. However, Cyrus Harding did not remember to have seen, at the time of his excursion to the crater, any other watercourses but the Red Creek and the Mersey. During the first part of their excursion, they saw numerous troops of monkeys who exhibited great astonishment at the sight of men, whose appearance was so new to them. Gideon Spilett jokingly asked whether these active and merry quadrupeds did not consider him and his companions as degenerate brothers. And certainly, pedestrians, hindered at each step by bushes, caught by creepers, barred by trunks of trees, did not shine beside those supple animals, who, bounding from branch to branch, were hindered by nothing on their course. The monkeys were numerous, but happily they did not manifest any hostile disposition. Several pigs, agoutis, kangaroos, and other rodents were seen, also 2 or 3 koalas, at which Pencroft longed to have a shot. "But," said he, "you may jump and play just now. We shall have 1 or 2 words to say to you on our way back." At 9:30, the way was suddenly found to be barred by an unknown stream, from 30 to 40 feet broad, whose rapid current dashed foaming over the numerous rocks which interrupted its course. This creek was deep and clear, but it was absolutely unnavigable. "We are cut off," cried Neb. "No," replied Herbert, "it is only a stream, and we can easily swim over." "What would be the use of that?" returned Harding. "This creek evidently runs to the sea. Let us remain on this side and follow the bank, and I shall be much astonished if it does not lead us very quickly to the coast. Forward." "1 minute," said the reporter. "The name of this creek, my friends. Do not let us leave our geography incomplete." "All right," said Pencroft. "Name it, my boy," said the engineer, addressing the lad. "Will it not be better to wait until we have explored it to its mouth?" answered Herbert. "Very well," replied Cyrus Harding. "Let us follow it as fast as we can without stopping." "Still another minute," said Pencroft. "What's the matter?" asked the reporter. "Though hunting is forbidden, fishing is allowed, I suppose," said the sailor. "We have no time to lose," replied the engineer. "Oh, 5 minutes," replied Pencroft. "I only ask for 5 minutes to use in the interest of our breakfast." And Pencroft, lying down on the bank, plunged his arm into the water, and soon pulled up several dozen of fine crayfish from among the stores. "These will be good," cried Neb, going to the sailor's aid. "As I said, there is everything in this island except tobacco," muttered Pencroft with a sigh. The fishing did not take 5 minutes, for the crayfish were swarming in the creek. A bag was filled with the crustacea, whose shells were of a cobalt blue. The settlers then pushed on. They advanced more rapidly and easily along the bank of the river than in the forest. From time to time, they came upon the traces of animals of a large size who had come to quench their thirst at the stream, but none were actually seen, and it was evidently not in this part of the forest that the peccary had received the bullet which had cost Pencroft a grinder. In the meanwhile, considering the rapid current, Harding was led to suppose that he and his companions were much farther from the western coast than they had at first supposed. In fact, at this hour, the rising tide would have turned back the current of the creek if its mouth had only been a few miles distant. Now, this effect was not produced, and the water pursued its natural course. The engineer was much astonished at this, and frequently consulted his compass to assure himself that some turn of the river was not leading them again into the far west. However, the creek gradually widened, and its waters became less tumultuous. The trees on the right bank were as close together as on the left bank, and it was impossible to distinguish anything beyond them. But these masses of wood were evidently uninhabited, for Top did not bark, and the intelligent animal would not have failed to signal the presence of any stranger in the neighborhood. Denizens of the forest, denizens of the forest. At 10:30, to the great surprise of Cyrus Harding, Herbert, who was a little in front, suddenly stopped and exclaimed, "The sea!" In a few minutes more, the whole western shore of the island lay, extended before the eyes of the settlers. But what a contrast between this and the eastern coast, upon which chance had first thrown them! No granite cliff, no rocks, not even a sandy beach. The forest reached the shore, and the tall trees bending over the water were beaten by the waves. It was not such a shore as is usually formed by nature, either by extending a vast carpet of sand or by grouping masses of rock, but a beautiful border consisting of the most splendid trees. The bank was raised a little above the level of the sea, and on this luxuriant soil supported by a granite base, the fine forest trees seemed to be as firmly planted as in the interior of the island. The colonists were then on the shore of an unimportant little harbor, which would scarcely have contained even 2 or 3 fishing boats. It served as a neck to the new creek, of which the curious thing was that its waters, instead of joining the sea by a gentle slope, fell from a height of more than 40 feet, which explained why the rising tide was not felt up the stream. In fact, the tides of the Pacific, even at their maximum of elevation, could never reach the level of the river, and doubtless millions of years would pass before the water would have worn away the granite and hollowed a practicable mouth. It was settled that the name of Falls River should be given to this stream. Beyond, towards the north, the forest border was prolonged for a space of nearly 2 miles. Then the trees became scarcer, and beyond that again, the picturesque heights described a nearly straight line which ran north and south. On the contrary, all the part of the shore between Falls River and Reptile End was a mass of wood, magnificent trees, some straight, others bent, so that the long sea swell bathed their roots. Now it was this coast, that is, all the Serpentine Peninsula, that was to be explored, for this part of the shore offered a refuge to castaways, which the other wild and barren side must have refused. The sea, the sea. The weather was fine and clear, and from the height of a hillock on which Neb and Pencroft had arranged breakfast, a wide view was obtained. There was, however, not a sail in sight. Nothing could be seen along the shore as far as the eye could reach. But the engineer would take nothing for granted until he had explored the coast to the very extremity of the Serpentine Peninsula. Breakfast was soon dispatched, and at 11:30 the captain gave the signal for departure. Instead of proceeding over the summit of a cliff or along a sandy beach, the settlers were obliged to remain under cover of the trees so that they might continue on the shore. The distance which separated Falls River from Reptile End was about 12 miles. It would have taken the settlers 4 hours to do this, on a clear ground and without hurrying themselves. But as it was, they needed double the time, for what with trees to go round, bushes to cut down, and creepers to chop away, they were impeded at every step, these obstacles greatly lengthening their journey. There was, however, nothing to show that a shipwreck had taken place recently. It is true that, as Gideon Spilett observed, any remains of it might have drifted out to sea, and they must not take it for granted that, because they could find no traces of it, a ship had not been cast away on the coast. The reporter's argument was just, and besides, the incident of the bullet proved that a shot must have been fired in Lincoln Island within 3 months. It was already 5 o'clock, and there were still 2 miles between the settlers and the extremity of the Serpentine Peninsula. It was evident that after having reached Reptile End, Harding and his companions would not have time to return before dark to their encampment near the source of the Mersey. It would therefore be necessary to pass the night on the promontory. But they had no lack of provisions, which was lucky, for there were no animals on the shore, though birds, on the contrary, abounded: jacamars, currawcoos, tragopans, grouse, lories, parrots, cockatoos, pheasants, pigeons, and 100 others. There was not a tree without a nest, and not a nest which was not full of flapping wings. Towards 7 o'clock, the weary explorers arrived at Reptile End. Here the seaside forest ended, and the shore resumed the customary appearance of a coast, with rocks, reefs, and sands. It was possible that something might be found here, but darkness came on, and the further exploration had to be put off to the next day. Pencroft and Herbert hastened on to find a suitable place for their camp. Amongst the last trees of the forest of the far west, the boy found several thick clumps of bamboos. "Good," said he, "this is a valuable discovery." "Valuable," returned Pencroft. "Certainly," replied Herbert. "I may say, Pencroft, that the bark of the bamboo cut into flexible laths is used for making baskets, that this bark, mashed into a paste, is used for the manufacture of Chinese paper, that the stalks furnish, according to their size, canes and pipes, and are used for conducting water, that large bamboos make excellent material for building, being light and strong, and being never attacked by insects. I will add that by sawing the bamboo in two at the joint, keeping for the bottom the part of the transverse film which forms the joint, useful cups are obtained, which are much in use among the Chinese. No, you don't care for that. But what? But I can tell you, if you are ignorant of it, that in India these bamboos are eaten like asparagus." "Asparagus 30 feet high," exclaimed the sailor, "and are they good?" "Excellent," replied Herbert, "only it is not the stems of 30 feet high which are eaten, but the young shoots." "Perfect, my boy, perfect," replied Pencroft. "I will also add that the pith of the young stalks, preserved in vinegar, makes a good pickle." "Better and better, Herbert." "And lastly, that the bamboos exude a sweet liquor, which can be made into a very agreeable drink." "Is that all?" asked the sailor. "That is all." "And they don't happen to do for smoking?" "No, my poor Pencroft." Herbert and the sailor had not to look long for a place in which to pass the night. The rocks, which must have been violently beaten by the sea under the influence of the winds of the southwest, presented many cavities in which shelter could be found against the night air. But just as they were about to enter one of these caves, a loud roaring arrested them. "Back!" cried Pencroft. "Our guns are only loaded with small shot, and beasts which can roar as loud as that would care no more for it than for grams of salt." And the sailor, seizing Herbert by the arm, dragged him behind a rock, just as a magnificent animal showed itself at the entrance of the cavern. It was a jaguar of a size at least equal to its Asiatic congeners, that is to say, it measured 5 feet from the extremity of its head to the beginning of its tail. The yellow color of its hair was relieved by streaks and regular oblong spots of black, which contrasted with the white of its chest. Herbert recognized it as the ferocious rival of the tiger, as formidable as the puma, which is the rival of the largest wolf. The jaguar advanced and gazed around him with blazing eyes, his hair bristling as if this was not the first time he had scented man. At this moment the reporter appeared round a rock, and Herbert, thinking that he had not seen the jaguar, was about to rush towards him, when Gideon Spilett signed to him to remain where he was. This was not his first tiger, and advancing to within 10 feet of the animal he remained motionless, his gun to his shoulder, without moving a muscle. The jaguar collected itself for a spring, but at that moment a shot struck it in the eyes, and it fell dead. Herbert and Pencroft rushed towards the jaguar. Neb and Harding also ran up, and they remained for some instants contemplating the animal as it lay stretched on the ground, thinking that its magnificent skin would be a great ornament to the hall at Granite House. "Oh, Mr. Spilett, how I admire and envy you!" cried Herbert in a fit of very natural enthusiasm. "Well, my boy," replied the reporter, "you could have done the same." At that moment, a shot struck the jaguar between the eyes, and it fell dead at that moment. A shot struck the jaguar between the eyes, and it fell dead. "I with such coolness." Imagine to yourself, Herbert, that the jaguar is only a hare, and you would fire as quietly as possible. "That is," rejoined Pencroft, "it is not more dangerous than a hare." "And now," said Gideon Spilett, "since the jaguar has left its abode, I do not see, my friends, why we should not take possession of it for the night." "But others may come," said Pencroft. "It will be enough to light a fire at the entrance of the cavern," said the reporter, "and no wild beasts will dare to cross the threshold." "Into the jaguar's house, then," replied the sailor, dragging after him the body of the animal. Whilst Neb skinned the jaguar, his companions collected an abundant supply of dry wood from the forest, which they heaped up at the cave. Cyrus Harding, seeing the clump of bamboos, cut a quantity, which he mingled with the other fuel. This done, they entered the grotto, of which the floor was strewn with bones. The guns were carefully loaded. In case of a sudden attack, they had supper, and then just before they lay down to rest, the heap of wood piled at the entrance was set fire to. Immediately, a regular explosion, or rather, a series of reports, broke the silence. The noise was caused by the bamboos, which, as the flames reached them, exploded like fireworks. The noise was enough to terrify even the boldest of wild beasts. It was not the engineer who had invented this way of causing loud explosions, for, according to Marco Polo, the Tartars have employed it for many centuries to drive away from their encampments the formidable wild beasts of Central Asia. Chapter 5. Proposal to return by the southern shore, configuration of the coast, searching for the supposed wreck, a wreck in the air, discovery of a small natural port, at midnight on the banks of the Mersey, the canoe adrift. Cyrus Harding and his companions slept like innocent marmots in the cave, which the jaguar had so politely left at their disposal. At sunrise, all were on the shore at the extremity of the promontory, and their gaze was directed towards the horizon, of which 2/3 of the circumference were visible. For the last time, the engineer could ascertain that not a sail nor the wreck of a ship was on the sea, and even with the telescope, nothing suspicious could be discovered. There was nothing either on the shore, at least, in the straight line of 3 miles which formed the south side of the promontory, for beyond that, rising ground hid the rest of the coast, and even from the extremity of the Serpentine Peninsula Cape Claw could not be seen. The southern coast of the island still remained to be explored. Now should they undertake it immediately and devote this day to it. This was not included in their first plan. In fact, when the boat was abandoned at the sources of the Mersey, it had been agreed that after having surveyed the west coast, they should go back to it and return to Granite House by the Mersey. Harding then thought that the western coast would have offered refuge either to a ship in distress or to a vessel in her regular course. But now, as he saw that this coast presented no good anchorage, he wished to seek on the south what they had not been able to find on the west. Gideon Spilett proposed to continue the exploration, that the question of the supposed wreck might be completely settled, and he asked at what distance Claw Cape might be from the extremity of the peninsula. "About 30 miles, replied the engineer, "if we take into consideration the curvings of the coast." 30 miles, returned Spilett. "That would be a long day's march. Nevertheless, I think that we should return to Granite House by the south coast." "But," observed Herbert, "from Claw Cape to Granite House there must be at least another 10 miles. "Make it 40 miles in all," replied the engineer, "and do not hesitate to do it. At least we should survey the unknown shore, and then we shall not have to begin the exploration again." "Very good," said Pencroft, "but the boat?" "The boat has remained by itself for 1 day at the sources of the Mersey," replied Gideon Spilett. "It may just as well stay there 2 days. As yet, we have had no reason to think that the island is infested by thieves." "Yet," said the sailor, "when I remember the history of the turtle, I am far from confident of that." The turtle," replied the reporter. "Don't you know that the sea turned it over?" "Who knows?" murmured the engineer. "But," said Neb. Neb had evidently something to say, for he opened his mouth to speak, and yet said nothing. "What do you want to say, Neb?" asked the engineer. "If we return by the shore to Claw Cape," replied Neb, "after having doubled the cape, we shall be stopped. "By the Mersey, of course," replied Herbert, "and we shall have neither bridge nor boat by which to cross." "But, Captain," added Pencroft, "with a few floating trunks, we shall have no difficulty in crossing the river." "Never mind," said Spilett, "it will be useful to construct a bridge if we wish to have an easy access to the far west." "A bridge!" cried Pencroft. "Well, is not the captain the best engineer in his profession? He will make us a bridge when we want one. As to transporting you this evening to the other side of the Mersey, and that without wetting one thread of your clothes, I will take care of that. We have provisions for another day, and besides we can get plenty of game. Forward." The reporter's proposal, so strongly seconded by the sailor, received general approbation, for each wished to have their doubts set at rest, and by returning by Claw Cape, the exploration would be ended. But there was not an hour to lose, for 40 miles was a long march, and they could not hope to reach Granite House before night. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the little band set out. As a precaution, the guns were loaded with ball, and Top, who led the van, received orders to beat about the edge of the forest. From the extremity of the promontory, which formed the tail of the peninsula, the coast was rounded for a distance of 5 miles, which was rapidly passed over, without even the most minute investigations bringing to light the least trace of any old or recent landings. No debris, no mark of an encampment, no cinders of a fire, nor even a footprint. From the point of the peninsula, on which the settlers now were their gaze could extend along the southwest. 25 miles off the coast terminated in the Claw Cape, which loomed dimly through the morning mists, and which, by the phenomenon of the mirage, appeared as if suspended between land and water. Between the place occupied by the colonists and the other side of the immense bay, the shore was composed first of a tract of low land, bordered in the background by trees. Then the shore became more irregular, projecting sharp points into the sea, and finally ended in the black rocks, which, accumulated in picturesque disorder, formed Claw Cape. Such was the development of this part of the island, which the settlers took in at a glance, whilst stopping for an instant. "If a vessel ran in here," said Pencroft, "she would certainly be lost. Sandbanks and reefs everywhere, bad quarters." "But at least something would be left of the ship," observed the reporter. "There might be pieces of wood on the rocks, but nothing on the sands," replied the sailor. "Why?" "Because the sands are still more dangerous than the rocks, for they swallow up everything that is thrown on them. In a few days, the hull of a ship of several hundred tons would disappear entirely in there." "So, Pencroft," asked the engineer, "if a ship has been wrecked on these banks, is it not astonishing that there is now no trace of her remaining?" "No, Captain, with the aid of time and tempest. However, it would be surprising, even in this case, that some of the masts or spars should not have been thrown on the beach, out of reach of the waves." "Let us go on with our search, then," returned Cyrus Harding. At 1 o'clock, the colonists arrived at the other side of Washington Bay, they having now gone a distance of 20 miles. They then halted for breakfast. Here began the irregular coast, covered with lines of rocks and sandbanks. The long sea swell could be seen breaking over the rocks in the bay, forming a foamy fringe. From this point to Claw Cape, the beach was very narrow between the edge of the forest and the reefs. Walking was now more difficult, on account of the numerous rocks which encumbered the beach. The granite cliff also gradually increased in height, and only the green tops of the trees which crowned it could be seen. After half an hour's rest, the settlers resumed their journey, and not a spot among the rocks was left unexamined. Pencroft and Neb even rushed into the surf whenever any object attracted their attention. But they found nothing, some curious formations of the rocks having deceived them. They ascertained, however, that eatable shellfish abounded there, but these could not be of any great advantage to them until some easy means of communication had been established between the two banks of the Mersey, and until the means of transport had been perfected. Nothing, therefore, which threw any light on the supposed wreck could be found on this shore, yet an object of any importance, such as the hull of a ship, would have been seen directly, or any of her masts and spars would have been washed on shore, just as the chest had been, which was found 20 miles from here. But there was nothing. Towards 3 o'clock Harding and his companions arrived at a snug little creek. It formed quite a natural harbor, invisible from the sea, and was entered by a narrow channel. At the back of this creek, some violent convulsion had torn up the rocky border, and a cutting, by a gentle slope, gave access to an upper plateau, which might be situated at least 10 miles from Claw Cape, and consequently 4 miles in a straight line from Prospect Heights. Gideon Spilett proposed to his companions that they should make a halt here. They agreed readily, for their walk had sharpened their appetites, and although it was not their usual dinner hour, no one refused to strengthen himself with a piece of venison. This luncheon would sustain them till their supper, which they intended to take at Granite House. In a few minutes, the settlers, seated under a clump of fine sea pines, were devouring the provisions which Neb produced from his bag. This spot was raised from 50 to 60 feet above the level of the sea. The view was very extensive, but beyond the cape it ended in Union Bay. Neither the islet nor Prospect Heights were visible, and could not be from thence, for the rising ground and the curtain of trees closed the northern horizon. It is useless to add that, notwithstanding the wide extent of sea which the explorers could survey, and though the engineer swept the horizon with his glass, no vessel could be found. The shore was, of course, examined with the same care from the edge of the water to the cliff, and nothing could be discovered even with the aid of the instrument. "Well," said Gideon Spilett, "it seems we must make up our minds to console ourselves with thinking that no one will come to dispute with us the possession of Lincoln Island." "But the bullet," cried Herbert, "that was not imaginary, I suppose." "Hang it, no," exclaimed Pencroft, thinking of his absent tooth. "Then what conclusion may be drawn?" asked the reporter. "This," replied the engineer, "that 3 months or more ago, a vessel, either voluntarily or not, came here." "What, then you admit, Cyrus, that she was swallowed up without leaving any trace?" cried the reporter. "No, my dear Spilett, but you see that if it is certain that a human being set foot on the island, it appears no less certain that he has now left it." "Then, if I understand you right, Captain," said Herbert, "the vessel has left again." "Evidently." "And we have lost an opportunity to get back to our country," said Neb. "I fear so." "Very well, since the opportunity is lost, let us go on. It can't be helped," said Pencroft, who felt homesickness for Granite House. But just as they were rising, Top was heard loudly barking, and the dog issued from the wood, holding in his mouth a rag soiled with mud. Neb seized it. It was a piece of strong cloth. Top still barked, and by his going and coming seemed to invite his master to follow him into the forest. "Now there's something to explain the bullet," exclaimed Pencroft. "A castaway," replied Herbert. "Wounded, perhaps," said Neb. "Or dead," added the reporter. All ran after the dog, among the tall pines on the border of the forest. Harding and his companions made ready their firearms in case of an emergency. They advanced some way into the wood, but to their great disappointment, they as yet saw no signs of any human being having passed that way. Shrubs and creepers were uninjured, and they had even to cut them away with the axe, as they had done in the deepest recesses of the forest. It was difficult to fancy that any human creature had ever passed there, but yet Top went backwards and forwards, not like a dog who searches at random, but like a being endowed with a mind, who is following up an idea. In about 7 or 8 minutes Top stopped in a glade surrounded with tall trees. The settlers gazed around them, but saw nothing, neither under the bushes nor among the trees. "What is the matter, Top?" said Cyrus Harding. Top barked louder, bounding about at the foot of a gigantic pine. All at once Pencroft shouted. Exclaimed Pencroft, "Now there's something to explain the bullet," exclaimed Pencroft. "Ho, splendid, capital." "What is it?" asked Spilett. "We have been looking for a wreck at sea or on land." Well, and here we've found one in the air." And the sailor pointed to a great white rag caught in the top of a pine, a fallen scrap of which the dog had brought to them. "But that is not a wreck," cried Gideon Spilett. "I beg your pardon," returned Pencroft. "Why is it?" "It is all that remains of our airy boat, of our balloon, which has been caught up aloft there at the top of that tree." Pencroft was not mistaken, and he gave vent to his feelings in a tremendous hurrah, adding, "There is good cloth, there is what will furnish us with linen for years, there is what will make us handkerchiefs and shirts. Ha, ha, Mr. Spilett, what do you say to an island where shirts grow on the trees?" It was certainly a lucky circumstance for the settlers in Lincoln Island that the balloon, after having made its last bound into the air, had fallen on the island and thus given them the opportunity of finding it again, whether they kept the case under its present form, or whether they wished to attempt another escape by it, or whether they usefully employed the several hundred yards of cotton, which was of fine quality. Pencroft's joy was therefore shared by all. But it was necessary to bring down the remains of the balloon from the tree, to place it in security, and this was no slight task. Neb, Herbert, and the sailor, climbing to the summit of the tree, used all their skill to disengage the now reduced balloon.